Hi, everyone. I am Dr. David Perrodin, and welcome to the Week 2 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership 655, Pupil Services and Nondiscrimination with Viterbo University. First off, thank you for the well wishes after my accident. I am recovering and feeling better every day, so that is great news to report. Learning teams have been assigned, so check which learning team you are on, and then in the syllabus outlines the case scenario for the student with an allergy. So you'd work with your learning team to come up with a plan for that student per what is outlined in the syllabus. Wanted to give some feedback on the week 1 article, The Right to Select Methodology. Many people commented about that. Even into week 2, brought up questions of, well, we have outside providers that come into our district, and are we making sure that we have a understanding of who that person's superior is, who we can contact in case of an emergency? What does it look like for background check? What kind of background check has that person gone through? Is it at the same level of depth that a typical school employee or volunteer would go through? And just the liabilities that play out. This does fall right in the middle of a student services director role, because most likely it would be somebody coming in to provide mental health services, possibly autism services or other kind of behavioral supports. The right to select methodology, it is a great discussion tool to go through and say, I'm not sure we have a memorandum of understanding. I'm not sure what happens when there is a contracted service that's coming into our school, paid through an outside funding source, and suddenly someone is on leave for a week and now somebody new shows up. So how has that person vetted? All good questions to go through. So I'm going to move us ahead to the week 2 annotation, the reflective teaching annotation, to be official. 504 idea, ADA, and allergies. So I'm working off the handout and some notes. So it is critical to understand the difference between 504, ADA, and IDEA. And it's really difficult right now. 504 to me has always been murky. So that's where, if you can get some guidance from your either legal representation for the district, or maybe go in with some other districts and seek through your state organization, WCAS, some guidance, presentations, making sure that your forms are current and up to date. Part of 504, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, that falls under federal mandates. So that has a whole different sense to it and how that needs to be managed. And then also, if there is a complaint, it's not the DPI that comes in to investigate that complaint. That is somebody out of OCR, much different. So making sure, and you do have the Dr. Gennerman document to help identify the significant differences between Section 504, ADA, and IDEA. What is happening right now, and a number of you had talked about it, 504s are becoming the catch basin for mental health diagnoses, depression, anxiety, just because there isn't an area in qualifying under IDEA for those, unless you put it into other health impaired. So if you're not going to put it into other health impaired, it has to go somewhere. It usually ends up becoming 504, or I guess some districts do those just through health plans. But it is very tricky for districts. And actually, I know districts that say, we don't do 504s. 504s also don't bring any dollars into the district. If you have a student receiving services and that student is receiving those because they're eligible under IDEA, then the district is receiving flow-through dollars. You don't receive dollars for 504. So I'm not saying that is why you should make decisions, but sometimes in districts you will see just everything has always been funneled through, we qualify under IDEA. So if it is a 504 type matter, they'll qualify a student under OHI. Not saying it's right or wrong, just saying that's the way some of these processes have evolved. I think we need more clarification from the Department of Public Instruction, frankly, on this matter. So one thing to know also about 504s, if there is a complaint with a 504 and OCR comes in to investigate, they will ask, where are the plans? And you need to know exactly where those plans are. Also, who at the building level is in charge at the building level. So if you have 10 buildings, 3 elementaries and a couple charter schools and a high school and middle school, whatever, each one of those buildings needs to have a 504 assigned coordinator, someone in that building, whether it be the principal or psychologist, that knows where the 504s are. That needs to happen. And also, you need to make sure that you have your compliance, that you're holding your meetings annually. And you have a different set of paperwork with that. You're not sending out the idea rights with that. But so I did give some sample forms from Manawa. These things change all the time. Consult with either your legal counsel or WCAS organization on who has some of the most current forms. Usually they'll share them with you. So, but I just wanted to point out, so if you have an investigation because of a 504 violation, OCR comes in. OCR can actually pull multiple files. They can say, okay, here's a complaint. We want to see 10 other students that have 504s, and they can go through those. So you do have this process where the DPI typically tries to work with you to resolve matters. OCR is much more direct in coming in and being very binary as they go through things. So just so you're aware of that, it is a much more sophisticated process, and also like the corrective action plans can be pretty intense. So one of the things also, when you qualify a student with a disability, okay, so here's the whole special ed process, and we can sometimes forget that the process has 2 steps. One is the IEP team qualifies the student as having a disability. The second part is that the student is in need and would benefit from special education or related services. So sometimes you could qualify a student as saying the student has a disability, but there's nothing we can do. There isn't a service we can provide, or the student is no longer, responding to services. And so a student could still technically have a disability and not have special education services. Doesn't happen a lot, but it is something to be aware of. That's always a 2-step process. Just because you qualify as having a disability, you also have to qualify then as requiring special education or related services. Understanding the difference between a service animal and a comfort animal, that's becoming more complicated. We've seen that in the news. Somebody tried to take like a pheasant or a peacock on a plane. And not to say that these are good or bad, but this is something you will encounter, whether it be a comfort, cat or a dog or whatever animal. So you need to make sure your policies are in place. Check with your school board, check with your district administrator. What policies do we have for ADA animals and service animals? Now, ADA animals, those policies have been out for quite a while, and but for comfort animals, having policies in place, because again, people will want you to do this. You'll have a lot of pressure from parents to do this, and in most cases, to have a comfort rabbit or things like that will be pretty non-invasive. But then once you've started that process, how do you make a determination on an animal by animal basis, and then also the health of the animal and that it's had its shots and all of those types of things? You know what I'm saying? It's very complicated. If you're not familiar, go to Neola, Neola policy. That's all one word, Neola policy.com. A lot of school districts in Wisconsin have their policies from Neola. I recommend Neola because they will make sure you have the most current policies in place, and then they will periodically update you. They'll let your board know and say, hey, there's been some new legislation that's come out with comfort animals, for example, and we're recommending here are some template policies that you review and modify your policies. So Neola can take a lot of that away from a board and a district administrator and a student service director having to craft all of these policies and things like that. And plus, there is a legal protection they provide where they do represent your district if there is ever a claim against a policy. I don't know all the details with that, but they've been around for quite a while. Very reliable. Policies do change at a federal and state level so often that it's something, as a special education director, I would ask in my interview if I was going somewhere, do you use Neola policy? And if not, are you open to considering that? Be careful in creating new policies or requirements. As once a policy is implemented, rarely are such ever reversed. Yes, absolutely true. So a few districts went with an ILP, individual learning plan. They put it in a policy and saying that every student would have an individual learning plan developed for them. And then the district kind of did an outline, and it was similar to like an IEP. Okay. Now that sounds great. But the district was not able to keep that in force, or some of these districts, because of the staffing requirement. And then how do you individually move students along a system which is really meant to go grade by grade? It wasn't well thought out. But because it had been policy, it was virtually impossible for the district to backtrack on that, because the parents wanted the ILPs and it was in policy, and they were pressuring the board to not undo that policy. So things like that. Also, like if you do I'll talk a little bit in allergy policy. Allergy policies can really limit what you can do as a district if you go down a very restrictive path with those policies. I'll talk about that in a minute. As far as like board policies, make sure your board is reviewing policies every 5 years, and your pupil services policies, like what we do for harassment and hazing and pupil non-discrimination, all of those types of things every 5 years are reviewed. I have been in expert witness cases where I literally have pulled out a policy that the last time it was even reviewed was 20 years ago. That is an instant loss for that district of trying to defend policy that doesn't even address harassment when social media is present, because obviously the policy was in existence before this. So make sure with the due diligence, most districts do this, but identify your pupil services policies, and that they, especially with in harassment, child fine, things in that area, and make sure that those are reviewed every 5 years. So HIPAA records have little impact on school, but here's something: never re-release records. So a student moves, you just don't package up their doctor reports and send them to the next district. You can't do that. You either have to destroy those, or what I would do, and I recommend, is I would put them together and provide them to the parent. And I'd say, if you want to provide these to the next district, that's up to you. I cannot legally re-release these. So just make sure to, when you have records, medical records coming in, that you keep them in a separate place, even a red folder or something, or if they're scanned in as an attachment to your Infinite Campus, Skyward, whatever system, that when the student leaves, then that gets deleted and destroyed. So now here's a tricky part. When a parent would come in, and I was a special education director, and would hand me a whole bunch of reports, I would immediately ask then for a release of information for the ones that I felt were relevant, that I needed to get updated information from doctors. And parents will say, "Oh no, these are all fine." And you have to take those legally. You can't deny accepting those from the parent, but I want those firsthand from the physician, because maybe there's a more current report out there. And also, I'm always a little skeptical, a healthy skepticism, that parents might not be providing you every page, everything. I did receive one time, this is actual, I received an evaluation that a parent brought in, and it had the name of the doctor and everything. And then the parent went through, it was like reading a report from the X-Files. It was blacked out, like just black mark all over, to like the line by line, things were taken out. And then it was photocopied, so you couldn't tell what was underneath. And legally, I had to use what was provided in making a determination as part of the IEP team for a disability with that student. The document was so scattered and inconclusive that the IEP team didn't feel any benefit could be drawn from it. But that's what you sometimes run into. So if you do receive those from a parent, that's a great way then to at least identify, here are the people I need to go to, the physicians, the outside providers, and then whatever that parent gave you, you need to destroy or you need to get back to the parent, give back so then they can keep those. So yes, don't re-release those. All right. Although money is important, it is not a cure-all. Absolutely true. Your induction process, just having that solid is great. Find your internal experts are all over the place, whether it be, autism, behavior intervention plans. They are there. Use them. You can create and access, YouTube videos if there's something that you're unfamiliar with. For example, like, some sensory diet stuff or things like that. So even like Pinterest has so much out there for information. Just, it's so ubiquitous now, a tool that we didn't have 10 or 15, 20 years ago when I was starting out. So just having those resources, of course you need money for some things, but you can get a lot of great information without having to go through and to make these massive purchases or to send people off to conferences and stuff like that. Let me move on here. So make sure that you explain and demonstrate bullying and harassment to students when you are educating them about school safety and then also about the threat reporting system. So bullying and harassment falls under pupil non-discrimination. Now, you can have it in a handbook, but most of that stuff in the handbook, if you took it right now, and I'd like somebody to do this, take out some sections of your student handbook, post it into any online reading level generator. There are a ton of them, and it'll say this is at a 12th grade level or whatever. It will always come in higher than what the student's level is. So if it's a 6th grade handbook, it's probably going to come out at a 12th grade level. I've seen it time and time again. So mess around with it a little bit. Try to make it more descriptive and then put it back into that system and see all of a sudden if now it's at an 8th grade level and whatever. That is a really responsible, due diligent special education director that does that. So be aware of what is in your handbooks and then going through the handbook with classroom by classroom, the sections that have to do with harassment, pupil non-discrimination, and reporting. And then demonstrating that, and then also asking questions. I mean, opening up, saying, does anybody have a question? And put together like an agenda and check off the classrooms and that you did this, because that will also protect you legally if there is a complaint coming back of saying students weren't educated to this. When I was in high school, you know what it looked like? It was the school principal who just handed out the handbook as you left. You picked one up, and you had to rip out the last page, which meant that you had read it all in one motion. While you pick it up, you open it, you rip out the page, and you put it in a box. And I think they already had your name on it, so I think somebody handed it to you as you were leaving. I went to a small high school. And of course, that doesn't cut it. You just can't say, well, they have access to the handbook. That's understanding. No, it's not understanding. So know that as a pupil services director, you need to at least have a minimum of going through that, or having your counselor, psychologist, or classroom teacher go through that the student, you demonstrate it and you ask the students if they have any questions. And I suggest that you do that at the start of the year and then also do it again mid-year, maybe after winter break. So be very vigilant for students with allergies. Because there is something called a RAST score, R-A-S-T. You'll see this sometimes, and it might be a score that is low, meaning a student is likely to get like a rash or something like that, and not have like this huge anaphylactic reaction where their windpipe closes, things like that. I worked with a school administrator who for years had worked at Red Lobster through college, and one day and loved seafood. And one day he took a bite of seafood and had a massive allergic reaction. And prior to that, had not had a single reaction to seafood. So I always treat allergies with a hypervigilance because because a student has had a mild reaction to a milk allergy or a clay allergy or whatever it is, doesn't mean the next time isn't going to be a much more severe reaction. So just keep people aware of that. It doesn't necessarily progress to get a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse. It can instantly become a significant reaction. So banning things from a school, having a process where we're banning all clay or we're banning peanuts. That's probably a really big one, a peanut ban. So how are you going to enforce that, though? If you actually ban peanuts, how will you enforce that every basketball game at your school where people are coming in and parents and things, that nobody has a peanut butter sandwich in their pocket, or that they didn't have peanut residue on their hands from something before? I mean, you come to this point and are you searching every backpack of every child, and somebody does bring a peanut butter sandwich to lunch by accident or something like that? If you start banning things, so it can be that, then the next thing, might be clay, and then it's latex, and then it's milk for milk allergies. And you end up with this perpetual list of banning things, and you don't even know, like, some of your school things does this contain a latex-like type product that you're going to react to or not? So you have so many things. It's better to be aware. It's better to have a policy that says we are an allergy aware district. Now, certainly this will all be individual. If you do have a student that does have a very hyper reaction to peanuts, like the residue, airborne residue, things like that, you would take every measure you could to remediate the risk of that. And of course, any measure to make sure that student was safe. So, but in most of these situations, if you just go to banning, it becomes this perpetual list of things that you add to the ban, and then you can't enforce it. It just is impractical to enforce that. You also then run into this thing where your food service provider, they might be purchasing a certain product from Cisco or whatever, and then 3 months later, it switches over to U.S. Foods, and U.S. Foods then has a certain chemical or a certain thing that's in, applesauce or whatever that wasn't in Cisco, and now a student has a reaction to that, or it changes up the carb counts. I did an article out there on, as a student services director, it's important to work with your kitchen to understand, for example, your type 1 diabetic students and carb counts, because kitchens will bid out, and they usually don't bid out for a year's worth of supply. They bid out for a month, and then after that supply is gone, they'll get more, but it could be from a different vendor, and that can have huge impacts for your type 1 diabetic students when you're serving. And yes, you have the same serving size, but now you have more sugar, maybe more carbohydrates than you had before. It's really hard to keep up with, but that is so valuable. We'll cover that more later in the class. So some shout outs. Okay, Peter, thank you so much for contacting me about Memorandum of Understanding in schools. For me, having a Memorandum of Understanding, if anybody is coming into my school to work with a student, if they're a third party, for example, not a CISA, we already have a contract that covers that. But if it's like a provider from a autism clinic or mental health counseling service, whatever, if they're coming in, I want to know background checks that have been done on that person. I want to know who their supervisor is. I want to know what instruction that they are delivering while they're on premise. I worked with a superintendent this fall in the superintendent law class, and the superintendent said, yeah, we had somebody come in from an outside agency, and they were doing this lesson on, learning about self and whatever. And one of the students was concerned that some of the materials they were showing were a little too much adult. And then he kind of moved on, and I said, well, wait a second. So what did you do? And he said, well, I did ask about it, and the students did say, yes, it was something that made them feel uncomfortable. And I said, well, here's the deal. You, as a school administrator, as a special education director, if that happens, you have the right to take anything that anyone is using for instruction in your school and look it over to make sure that it is appropriate. I'm not saying that there was something overtly inappropriate that was shown to these students, but you have the right You have a lot of power. You are an administrator. You oversee the well-being of the students and the best interests of those students. So if someone is saying, oh, I can't show you the materials I'm using to help the student deal with anxiety because they're proprietary, or, for whatever reason, it's like, well, then you can't be in the building anymore. I need to know what you are showing to the student, because I need to make sure I am looking out for the best interests of that student in my building. And if you're bringing in those materials, I have the right to inspect those materials. You will have pushback on that, and parents will be upset, and the provider will say, no, I can't show this to you. Again, this is in some cases, other cases they might. But you can say, no, if you intend to be here, I need to see those. I can sit down with you. You don't need to give them to me, but I need to know what you're using for instructional materials. Again, as the administrator in school, I think people underestimate the level of power that they have. And you have a lot of power. Again, you are looking out for the best interest of students, and you can make those decisions in that context and situation. And also, for Sharon, your week 2 discussion, question 1 response about Susie and Jeffy, it was excellent. You pointed out, calling the parent back right away. And it's kind of a cheesy question that I put in there a little bit, but it's real process directed. And that's what I wanted you to think about. So hopefully a lot of you are kind of like, I think there's a deeper purpose that David put this one in here. But yeah, it is the fact that you want to make sure when you get those calls, what'll happen if something occurs at night is the parent will go through and they'll try to call the special education director, the principal, the teacher, and all of this. So in the morning, it's kind of whoever picks their phone up first and takes a voicemail is the one that's responding. But you don't want the parent to get into a pattern of circumventing the principal or the teacher. So, I always recommend you get on the phone and you call your building principal and say, hey, I had a message from whoever, and here's their concern about what's happening in your building. Are you aware of it? And sometimes principal will be aware, sometimes they won't. But give that heads up with the principal. You want to keep that professional relationship with that principal, not having the principal feel that their power has been usurped by you, that now the parents can just go to you. And of course, that's not your role. Things should be handled at a building level, the teacher investigating, the principal investigating, and then ultimately if something can't be resolved, it might come up to you at a district level. But for the most part, those are all building issues. And of course, listening to people, I got really good at that. I'd listen and take notes. And I tell people, I'm taking notes right now as we're talking because what you're telling me is important. I want to make sure that when we get done, I have the points down and I'm going to say them back to you. They'll respect that. They'll be like, fine. And then when I got done with the conversation, I would read that back to the parent and say, here's what I understand is like your 4 points. And then also like, I'm going to need some time to look into this. So I'm going to, meet with I'm going to go over to the building. I'm going to, get some information and see what they're doing, in the building, because the building's going to be closest to this. And you'll hear back from either, somebody at the building principal, or myself. And usually I try to push that back to the building because that's where you want the power to be, at the unit of measure or where the event happened, which would be the building. So again, and then calling, just telling people, well, I'll give you a call back. And then always asking, what do you want as a resolution out of this? And sometimes people say, I was just so frustrated, I wanted to be heard. And it's like, okay, and we'll still do our due diligence of going through the investigation on this and getting this information. And you'll also have people say, and I'll be at the board meeting tomorrow night, and I'm going to, present to the board for 3 minutes about how the school doesn't do anything for bullying, and it's just crazy, and it's that way when I was here and whatever. So then you want to do a little awareness with your superintendent, say, hey, this is what was shared with me, so there can be some preparation. At least, that if something like that does come up, you can have your documentation of here's things that we have done, for example, in educating staff and students about pupil services and non-discrimination. Not that you're countering what somebody's saying at a board meeting, but usually that's the type of information that a school board, for example, would say, hey, to the superintendent, what are we specifically doing for training in that? And the superintendent then can provide that like in the next board packet. It's kind of a monitoring report from the student services director, pupil services director, saying, here's what we've done over the last year at the buildings for pupil service non-discrimination, for harassment education, for harassment awareness, things like that. So this one a little long. I had a lot to cover, but I did speak as fast as I could. And thank you so much. Let's have a great week 2 and launch into a week 3. And stay safe on the roads, everybody.